Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Russ Morrow, and it's my pleasure to act as host for this week's virtual summit brought to you by NAPW. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the NAPW members who are joining us today and who've joined us at previous sessions during the course of the week. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, NAPW is an online and face-to-face community made up of over 850,000 professional women who join together to cultivate valuable business connections, develop professionally, and promote themselves and their businesses. To learn more about the NAPW and the many benefits of membership, please make sure that you visit our website at napw.com. This afternoon's session is negotiating skills, how to create the win-win scenario. And it's part of our 3-day virtual summit for entrepreneurs, where over the course of 12 interactive sessions, we're looking to offer some amazing information and guidance from experts who provide insights on how to plan, how to launch, how to run, and how to expand your business. Topics covered already and over the next day include how to get started, how to market your business, how to manage your finances and taxes, and the benefits of using virtual professionals. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, a few housekeeping points. Everybody is on mute, so don't worry, you can't be heard if you sneeze or cough. Now, we're going to get a lot of questions, no doubt about that. So throughout today's session, you'll be able to submit written questions, and we're looking at providing time at the end of the session to answer those. Now, depending on the volume, we may not get to all of the questions, but we will try to do our best to answer them via blog post or by email, but we'll look to find a way to communicate those answers to you. And the question that is always asked, will I be able to see the presentation again if I miss something? Yes, you will. Recording of this webinar and all the others over the course of the virtual summit this week will be available to view again here on the Bright Talk platform, and will be emailed to you as well. So, delighted to introduce our guest speaker for this session. Sandy Vasher is a Harvard Law School grad and a former litigator. She's mediated and trained fellow negotiators and mediators at the Harvard Mediation Program and the Harvard Program on Negotiation in Cambridge, and at the Center for Conflict Resolution in Chicago. Since 2010, Sandy has been a corporate negotiation trainer and consultant, and her clients have included many Fortune 500 companies in the automotive, the energy, hospitality, medical, pharmaceutical, construction, and the hobby industries, amongst others. Now, in this session, Sandy will provide you with negotiation techniques that you can use to win business, to save money with suppliers, to build long-lasting business relationships, and ultimately to succeed in your own business venture. It's a pleasure to welcome Sandy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Russ, for that introduction, and I am really excited to be here today. As Russ said, I specialize in teaching people how to negotiate, but I feel really privileged to be here today at NAPW because I've been training and consulting in this field for a little over a decade, but my partner and I just started Vasher McRoberts this year. So for me, as a woman entrepreneur myself, I feel like I'm facing a lot of the challenges that the summit has been tackling. So fantastic synergy of resources here with these videos. I know I am learning a lot, and I hope that those of you tuning into this webinar are going to get a lot out of this topic. And what we are going over today is negotiation skills. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is going to cover how to develop confidence throughout the negotiation process, how to create value, how to negotiate on price, whether you are the buyer or the seller, and how to collaborate with others for mutual gain, and lots of other things along the way as well, because in order to get these skills, what we're really going to be thinking about is the process of negotiation as a whole. But for right now, let's begin by thinking about a little thought exercise. So first, I want you to think about what is a negotiation. And second, how do you feel about negotiating? And as you guys are thinking about that, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the negotiators that I have worked with. So in my experience as a trainer, I've been able to work with individuals, with nonprofits, with Fortune 500 companies, with government entities. And a lot of times, the people that I train are buyers or sellers, or maybe they work in HR and specifically deal with disputes, or potentially they negotiate on behalf of a union. So a lot of times they think of themselves as professional negotiators. But I think that business owners in particular are the real professional negotiators, because we have to negotiate everything, and we're asking for something all of the time. So if you think about my first question here, what is a negotiation? Let's see if anybody's able to answer that yet. So if you're thinking about what is a negotiation, a lot of times people say negotiation is something like compromising with another person, or resolving a dispute, or a process of trading off things that two people need. But what we would say is that negotiation is really any time that you have to ask for something. So if you are in a conversation where you've got to persuade someone to do something, you are basically negotiating. And of course, as business owners, that means that we are negotiating literally all of the time. So when you negotiate with a vendor, with a supplier, with somebody who's your landlord, or with your employee, or with your business partner, you are negotiating. So I see that somebody marked both parties winning, and we absolutely want win-wins in those situations. Has anybody thought about how you feel about negotiating? Because even though we want those win-wins, one of the things that we find about negotiating is that it's actually a really frightening thing for a lot of people. So this is both women and men. People will tell us they don't like negotiating because they're afraid of conflict, or because they aren't particularly aggressive themselves, or sometimes they think of it as a game. And with women in particular, women will say they feel that they're at a disadvantage, or worse, they'll say that they're afraid of backlash. Or somebody here said, not sure about negotiating, seems confrontational, right? And that's another problem, is not only might you experience backlash, but it could be a confrontational kind of event. For women in particular, it is true that women are sometimes at a disadvantage in negotiation for various reasons, not reasons that can't be corrected. So if you're interested in that, you should follow me and my company. I'm going to be doing a gender and negotiation webinar. But today we're talking kind of nuts and bolts. So I'm going to give you the good news about gender and negotiation right now. And that is that you can fix any potential disadvantage that comes from gender with two things. And that is preparing really well for your negotiation and practicing. So we can help with both of that. That means that for you as a negotiator, the more experience you get and the more you're sort of willing to get in there and try things, the more confident you will be. And the more well-prepared you are before your negotiation. So the better you do your homework, the more confidence you will have. So the bulk of today, we are going to be talking about what a negotiation should look like and how it is that you're going to prepare for a negotiation. So I'm going to talk you through 4 phases of an interest-based negotiation. And if you are not familiar with what interest-based negotiation means, don't worry. I'm going to explain it in just a couple of minutes. But at a general level, it's a model of negotiation. And if you have read Getting to Yes, or if you are familiar with any of the books from the program on negotiation at Harvard, interest-based negotiation is essentially the model that came out of the program on negotiation. And the emphasis in interest-based negotiation is on long-term business relationships. So the reason that this is important for you as an entrepreneur is our goal is not just for both parties to win, but for both parties to want to negotiate with each other again. And in a situation where somebody did lose a little, for them still to be building trust in that negotiation. So we're going to talk about these 4 phases of an interest-based negotiation. And the 4 phases are, first of all, exploration. So this is where we think about who's at the table, what do they want, and why do they want it. And then expansion. So this is where we think about what are all of the resources and options that everybody brings to the table, and how can we make the pie bigger. Then we think about division. So this is where we say, all right, now we know what everybody has, and we've got to decide how to divide all of our available resources, or sometimes this is where making an offer happens. And then we have phase 4, which is agreement, and ideally this is agreeing to close a deal and sign a contract, but it could also be agreeing to walk away. And because we are focused, again, on that long-term business relationship, we even want to think of a walkaway as something that we negotiate because we are negotiating the relationship the entire time. So let's go through these phases. And we are going to start with explore. So when we are in the exploration phase of negotiation, both in the negotiation itself and when you're thinking about preparing for your negotiation, what we are talking about is, do we really understand the people that we're negotiating with and what they want? So a lot of times when people come to a negotiation, and I think this can sometimes be especially true of women, we assume that we are there because we need something. So we're asking for something from the other side, and we have a problem that we need to solve, and we're asking the other person to help us with it. We forget that a lot of times, in fact most times, the other side also has a problem to solve, and they wouldn't be spending time with you if they didn't think that you had something that they needed. So a big thing for creating value and really getting that win-win is understanding why the other person is there and what it is that they are looking for. So in our explore phase, this is our main goal, is to figure out why are they there, what are their goals, and also what are our goals, and do they understand them. So the first thing that you're going to think about when you are preparing for your negotiation is who's at the table. And this is kind of a tricky question, actually, because not every party that should be negotiating with you is always going to be visible. So I'll give you a really quick story. I live in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association. And if you are not familiar with these, basically a homeowners association creates rules for the neighborhood and maintains common areas. And a couple of years ago, I was on the board and got in a situation where there was a dispute amongst board members over a family that had painted part of their house a color that was not in the regulations. So specifically, there was a fence. They had painted it white, and fences in our area were supposed to be brown or black. Now, this did not seem like a major thing to me. So my opinion was that we should just let them keep their fence whatever color they wanted to paint it. But there was another board member who was really against it and really wanted to force our neighbors to repaint their fence. So as a lawyer and negotiator, I thought I would try to solve this with him, and I spent hours talking out this situation and trying to come up with a compromise and trying to figure out like what we all really wanted here. And then one day I realized that the best thing I could do was go and sit down with him at his house, maybe over a cup of coffee, and try to, like, in a relaxed setting, work this out. So I paid my neighbor, the board member, a call. And when I got to his house, I was greeted by his wife, who it turns out was a designer and had like a particular eye for color. And one of the first things that she did was point me out her window and show me how she could see this terrible eyesore in the neighborhood, and what a bad thing that it was for her. And I realized that I had committed a fatal mistake in my negotiation. I had failed to figure out who the real parties to the negotiation were. I thought I was negotiating with my fellow board member. I was not. The main decision maker was his wife. And if I had known that in advance, then I might have saved myself hours and hours of time and maybe come up with a resolution a lot sooner. So in your prep for a negotiation, one of your critical jobs in the very beginning is, am I negotiating with the right person? Who's sitting with me right now? What are their roles? And if this isn't the decision maker, then who really needs to be there? And this is a big point for you as well. Nobody likes to negotiate with the middleman. So it's not helpful for you if you are negotiating with somebody who doesn't really have decision-making power, in the sense that that person can't really make a call or can't really influence the person who's actually going to sign a deal or say yes. But likewise, the person sitting across from you doesn't want to negotiate with the middleman. So it's also important when you sit down at a negotiation and when you're thinking about your prep to think about who it is that you're going to introduce yourself as. So are you the manager? Are you the director of the project? If not, how are you going to convey yourself generally so that you look like you have confidence and you're showing that, like, yes, you should be the person that they talk with. And that might simply be you presenting an agenda, or you saying, I thought we would talk through these things, or explaining your role on the team in some way that shows that you matter. I see that there are some questions about this, and we've got a lot to get through. Somebody asked, should you ask the question, are you the decision maker? I think probably you don't put it quite like that. Like, you probably wouldn't say, so are you the decision maker? But it might be appropriate just to ask, what their role on the team is generally. And also to ask if there's anybody else that needs to sign off on a deal. So like a tactful way to do it might be to say, thanks so much for your time. Is there anybody else that we need to be thinking about at this negotiation who also is going to need to approve whatever we agree to? Because if you don't know, then you could be negotiating entirely with the wrong person. Now, that's just the parties. We also need to be thinking about what they want. And a problem for negotiators is that when we come into a negotiation, a lot of times we are negotiating from what we call positions. So let me illustrate the concept of positions with a little simple story that some of you may have heard before. So suppose that two sisters are fighting over one orange in their house. So there's this one orange on the counter. They both came down to the kitchen, and they both want the orange. And I'm going to open this up to your questions. So what should two sisters do if they both want one orange? So you should be getting that announcement. So we've got one orange, and we have two sisters who want it. So this is a limited resource situation. And I see people are saying things like half the orange. That's definitely something they could do, right? They could cut it right in half. They might consider that to be a fair division of a limited resource. There are other fair ways to do this. So potentially they would decide on a fair process. So maybe they would flip a coin, and then one person gets the whole orange, but at least they feel that how they made the decision was fair. I like somebody wrote, depends on who is stronger. So maybe they could like arm wrestle over it. And honestly, that's how international negotiations can feel sometimes, that it's about who is physically stronger. So these are all things that somebody could do. I've also heard people say things like, maybe mom comes around and auctions off the orange, right? Like, who's willing to pay her 25 cents for it? Who's willing to pay her 50 cents? There are all kinds of ways that we can figure out how we're going to divide this orange if it is a limited resource. But if one of them just says to the other, why do you want the orange? Then it could be that we find out that one of them wants to eat the orange and the other person is actually interested in baking a spice cake. So maybe they only want the peel of the orange or the rind, and they don't actually need the inside. And if that is the case, then everybody gets what they want. The sister who wants to eat the orange gets the pulp. The sister who wants to bake with it gets the peel, and we are all happy. And that is the classic win-win scenario. So if you ever hear the concept win-win, that is it, right, where we figure out that we both have different needs for the same limited resource, and there's some way for us to synergize that resource and make it so that it's bigger than we thought it was to begin with. Now, this is kind of a contrived example, so I'm going to get to that in just a second, but let's use it for a minute just to define some terms here. A lot of times in a negotiation, you are going to hear somebody walk in and say something like, I want the orange. So it will sound like, I want X. I want a 10% discount. I want that report 10 days earlier. I want payment in net 30 instead of net 60, or whatever it is that they think that they want. Very rarely do people walk into a negotiation telling you why they want what they want. So one of your jobs as a negotiator is to be the person who asks why questions. You want to figure out what are the real needs behind those positions. And you can actually use I want X as kind of a cue. So you hear somebody say, I want whatever, almost always that is a position. And that should say to you, oh my gosh, like that's not actually what they want. They're just saying that that's what they want, and now I've got to figure out what they really want by asking things like, why do you want that? Tell me more about that. Is this the important part or is that the important part? If you do that, then hopefully you find yourself in a peel pulp situation, and you learn that the resource you thought was limited actually is not. But look, we live in the real world. A lot of times, you both want to eat the orange. Even if that is the case, though, you always want to continue to ask these why questions, because sometimes interests help you determine the best way to divide a limited resource. So, for example, it could be that one sister wants to eat the orange for breakfast and one wants it for an afternoon snack. If that's the case, then maybe dividing the orange right this second doesn't make that much sense. Maybe one person pays the other a quarter for the convenience of getting to eat the orange now, and the other person has to go out to the store and buy an orange for this afternoon. But you don't know that. You don't know the best way to divide that resource unless you ask that why question. Now, one more thing on this, which is that interests are kind of like onions. So if you think you understand what the other side wants, check again. Probably there's something underneath even the first interest that you uncover. And that means that when you are preparing for a negotiation, you've really got to dig deep and ask yourself, what do I really care about? What are my real goals here? And then also, what might their goals be, and what assumptions might I be making about their goals? Because if it's possible that you're making negative assumptions about what they want, like let's say you think they only care about money, then maybe in your negotiation you should ask questions to try to uncover if you're right or not. So question your own assumptions and ask questions in the negotiation to find out if maybe somebody cares about something that you didn't think they were going to care about, because that's where the real opportunity for those win-wins comes in. Okay. Now, we need to move on to our phase 2. So suppose that we get to a place where we really do understand what the other side cares about, and we understand that they are the right people to negotiate, and we know what we care about, and we've traded a little bit of information on that. If we get to that point, then we want to move on to collaborating and thinking about all of the ways that we could work together to come up with a really great solution for both of us. So this is where we move into expand. And when we talk about expand, what we're saying is how do we take all of the resources that we all have and make them bigger? So if you ever hear somebody talk about the pie in negotiation and expanding the pie, that's where we are right now in our process. It's saying maybe I can provide services and maybe you come to the table with other services, or maybe you come to the table with money. What are all the things that we come to the table with, and how can we synergize those resources to make them stronger resources, or to make them bigger resources, or to make them work better for one or both of us? So it is worth thinking at this point about a little bit of lingo. So when it comes to negotiation, we really want you to think of negotiation, especially in this interest-based way, as a problem-solving activity. And what that's going to mean is that there are two possible outcomes to any negotiation, or at least two broad categories of outcomes. And the first category is the place where you agree to a deal. So if you're going to agree to a deal, then there are lots of different deals that you could agree to. And as far as lingo goes, we call all of the potential deals, and even like all of the parts of any potential deal that you could agree to, options. So options are things that you could agree to with the other side. But the second set of possible outcomes to a negotiation is you don't agree and you have to walk away. So if you have to walk away from a negotiation, then you've got to figure out how to solve that problem that you were negotiating over by yourself. And in that case, what we're going to be looking at is what we call alternatives. So when we speak about alternatives in negotiation, we're talking about things that you can do by yourself. So unilateral stuff where you don't need the other side to agree to it. If they walk away, these are things that you are going to do instead of whatever deal you might have had with the other side. And this is really important because your alternatives are going to help you figure out what a good option is. So you're going to measure good options based on how they stack up against what you could do outside of a negotiation. Now, I see somebody has written a question, is walking away from a negotiation simply a failure? And there are a couple questions there that it looks like I wasn't able to answer yet. So hopefully we can get to all of those. Is walking away from a negotiation simply a failure? So that we're going to get to in just a second because it's a really important question to ask. For right now, let's be optimists, and let's say that we are going to get a deal. So if we're going to get a deal, then we want to think about options. And this means thinking about better options and ways to add value to your deals. So a couple of things that you want to think about here. First of all, it is ideal if you and the other person can basically create a list of all of the things that you bring to the table. So your collaboration to create that win-win starts with exploring interests and continues with saying, okay, now that we know what we each want, what do we have? What can we give? What can we work with that's on this table here? And for a business owner, this is potentially a lot of things. So it might be services that you provide. It might be money that somebody has. It might be people. It might be time. It could be that you have referrals or some kind of way to help somebody find business that they didn't have before. There's a lot of different resources that you can build. But remember, our goal with this kind of negotiation is to build trust too. So something that you'll hear in negotiation, this is kind of conventional wisdom, is that information is power, and you shouldn't share information with the other side. So if you have heard that before, it might make you think, gosh, like maybe I shouldn't tell them everything that I have. Maybe I shouldn't give away all of my cards. And it probably is true that, you need to trust your instincts. So, you shouldn't be naive about what you tell the other side. However, we find that people build trust by giving information. So you give a little information about something that you can do to the other side, and they're likely to give a little information about something they can do to you. So you are going to be able to get more from them if you're willing to give a little bit. And that's how we build trust with the other person. And you can also, as you're thinking about building better options, build in places to brainstorm in your negotiation. So actually say, I was hoping that we could maybe talk through some ideas that I've had that might be a little creative or might be a little out of the box, or have a what-if conversation. So if you feel like saying, I'd like to brainstorm is like a little gimmicky, then you can go, what if I was able to give you a 10% discount? How would that change what you could do for me? So, put it in a, if I could do this, what could you do kind of way to open up that conversation to different ideas and see if you can get more from them just on the table. You can also think about distributive options, but also integrative options. So a lot of times when we come to negotiation, we believe that what we are negotiating is money. So we're talking about price, or maybe we're talking about deadlines, or we're talking about some other kind of option that is distributive because it is a limited or quantitative kind of option. But you want to look for integrative options too, and these are options where you can do something for the other side or they can do something for you that's very low cost, but that adds a lot of value. And there's a lot of different ways that that could happen. So, I mean, think things like guest blogging for somebody, or inviting them to a networking event that they otherwise didn't know about. There's a lot of ways that you can add value to a deal that you might not even be thinking about ahead of time. So when you're brainstorming, look at those things as well. And then also, and this is kind of a big thing for process, it is hard to prepare for brainstorming. So you should certainly come into the negotiation with as many ideas as you can about what you can do for the other side. And you should also know your limitations. So you should know things like what your budget is. Or if you're selling something, you should know things like how low you can go in terms of price and what a really good price would be for you. But you probably shouldn't assume that your very, very, very best ideas are going to happen inside one negotiation. So don't treat negotiation as a one-shot deal. Remember, we are building a relationship here. So it's always possible for you to say, let's have a half an hour phone call where we talk about, generally what it is that we're looking for and what kinds of resources we have, and then take a break. So even build into your negotiation a spot where you say, this is a lot of information. I'm really glad that we had this phone call. Why don't we take this all back and kind of think about it and then come back next week with some proposals? And by doing that, what you give yourself is some time to think of the really brilliant ideas, because those ideas that you got from being in that meeting with the other person and brainstorming with them and collaborating with them, those are all going to percolate in your head. And you might need to sleep on it for a night. And then maybe tomorrow morning you have just a brilliant idea about something that you could do together that you wouldn't have had if you rushed it. If you have the time to do it, it's always a good idea to give your brain just a little breathing room so that you get those really great ideas out. And by the way, give them the breathing room too. They aren't necessarily going to come up with their best ideas in the negotiation. They might come up with something outside of it. So think about that as you're building those options and really collaborating to get more. But of course, even in an ideal world where you come up with all kinds of great things that you can do for each other, there's going to be a point at which somebody has got to put an offer on the table, or somebody is going to have to say, this is what I can do for you, what can you do for me, really. So we're going to move on then to phase 3, which is divide. And this is where we think about offers and how to actually make those proposals that you want to make to the other side. Now, note that we have already gone through 2 phases here, right? And they were kind of long. We talked about exploring parties and interests and expanding options and brainstorming and even taking a break. And in a negotiation that you see in, say, like a movie, you're probably not going to see it that way. So in sort of a traditional negotiation or a media negotiation, what you are probably used to seeing is somebody putting an offer on the table right away. So they come in and they say, this is what I want. Well, in an interest-based negotiation, we're going to call that first offer a position and basically say, you don't have enough information at the very beginning of your negotiation to call that even a real offer. So don't say that to the other side, but treat the first thing that they say like that as just a position. And spend a little bit of time on interests, on expanding options, before you get to the point where you do decide that you're going to make an offer, because that's going to make it so that you have better information to base your offer on. Somebody just asked, is it sensible to state that a negotiation may take some time? I think what's sensible is to set expectations and to find out what's realistic for the other side. I mean, there are circumstances where you don't have weeks and weeks to negotiate, but there are circumstances where you do. So maybe in that explore phase, you make one of your questions, when do you need to know? When do you need an answer? Or if you need an answer, you make that something that you bring out. And yeah, I think if you both have time, then it's perfectly sensible in early stages to say, hey, would it be okay for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about what resources we both bring to the table, and then come back with a proposal later on? Because that transparency makes you trustworthy. So you be transparent about your process, and they'll tell you if it doesn't work for them. Now, okay, so let's think about this divide thing, though, because obviously we want you to get really good deals. So when you get to that price negotiation, and you are ready to put an offer on the table, the most important thing that you want to be thinking about is you aren't haggling. So we are not in a flea market negotiation when we are in business. This is not they said 10, you said 1, and you're going to split the difference. Because when you do that kind of negotiation in business, it's really kind of arbitrary. We lose trust. So we make the other side feel like we are playing a game with them. Now, note, this is cultural. There are some places where haggling, sort of like asking really high and then responding really low, is common. So, you need to be aware of that. But in a lot of business negotiations, the trend is away from that and towards fact-based negotiation, and negotiation that's really tied to numbers. So when you are ready for your negotiation, one favor that you can do for yourself is to sort of step back and say, okay, I have all this information from them. I know what they want. So now I've really got to think about, how would an objective person figure out what was fair? If they were going, if somebody outside of this negotiation was going to look in and figure out what a fair deal would be, how would they decide that? And keep in mind that fair is really a subjective term. So there's a lot of ways that you can make a negotiation fair. And when we're thinking about prices in particular, there's probably a number of prices that you could justify in some way. So for example, if you're pricing something that you are providing, let's say you're pricing a service for somebody else, you could price it based on your costs, or you could price it based on the market value, or maybe you could price it based on you being the only person in the market doing it. So, there are a number of things that you could look at to figure out how to price something. When you do it, you should make your first offer the best possible offer for you that you can justify with something that will make it seem reasonable. So this is fair to you, basically, or something that isn't laughable. And this is fine. So this is not an aggressive, it's not an overly aggressive kind of move. We're not asking you to ask for something, to ask for the moon or to ask for something totally unreasonable. Just don't sell yourself short. So assume that the first thing that you put on the table is going to be the best possible thing that you can get. You're not going to be able to negotiate up from there. You're probably going to be negotiating down. So be a little bit aspirational and ask for the best thing first. Also, don't forget all of those integrative options. So anything that you talked out that was added value but low cost, add that in to your proposals. And when you talk about that, if you want to provide a justification, tie it to their interests. So talk about why you thought this was valuable to them based on something that they told you they cared about. And then lastly, prepare a second offer. So have a compromise ready that's based on the second best way that you could justify something for yourself, so that you're not just splitting the difference when you get to that point in the negotiation. Okay, so that's thinking about an offer, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but we want to think about the other side of this. So when we are on divide, there's also always the possibility of walking away. And remember, we talked about alternatives and said that alternatives are what you do if you don't get a deal. Almost always, there's what we call a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So suppose that you are negotiating with a printer, and the current negotiation, the printer that you're talking with could save you a little money. But there are two other printers in the area that could provide the same services, and printer A could save you maybe a little more money, and printer B could save you even more money than that. If you can't get a deal in your current negotiation, then what you're going to do is get a deal with printer B, because that's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And when you are in your current negotiation, you're going to want to pay attention to that, because if printer B can save you a lot more money than the person that you are working with right now, then success might not be agreeing to a deal. So somebody asked, is walking away from a negotiation simply a failure? No, it's not. In fact, the failure, the really tragic failure for negotiation is when you agree to something that's worse than your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you get so excited about that yes, that you agree to it because you think yes is success. No, it's not. Success in negotiation is getting something better than your best alternative. And this actually leads me to another kind of important point, which is that you don't just want to get better than your best alternative. You want to get a lot better than your best alternative. When we feel weak in negotiation, we have this tendency to start our offers out kind of close to our best alternative. So we sort of go, oh, I only need to get like a little bit better than my best alternative. Why? Why shouldn't you start with the best thing for you that you could possibly get regardless of your best alternative? I mean, either way, your deal needs to be between either what's the best thing that you could justify and your best alternative. So you want to start from the top, not the bottom, and try to move down from there. And then you only walk away if you can't get something that is better than that best alternative. Okay. Now, I'm seeing some questions here, and I want to save some time for that. So let's go on to phase 4. I know there's a lot we could talk about with that. But we need to get to the point where we think about agreeing, right? And when we get an offer on the table that the other side is willing to say yes to, now what we have to do is decide, okay, so if we have a deal, how are we going to close this thing? And there are some key things that you want to think about when it comes to closing a deal. So first of all, specifics. It is not good enough to just sort of shake hands. If you want a good deal, you got to know who, what, when, where, and how, and have all those details buttoned up before you leave your negotiation. If you don't, then it is very possible that you think you got a deal. The other side said, yeah, that sounds good, but you just didn't quite work out everything. And then it turns out that they sort of forget some things, or you can't work out specific details later. So make sure that you've got those key things done, and that again is who, what, when, where, and how. So nice, easy stuff that you should always be thinking about. To make sure that you did it, we recommend summarizing your main points before you leave. So actually verbally say, thanks so much for your time. Let me just make sure that I've got all this right. We agreed to X, Y, and Z. And if your lawyers will allow it, consider even emailing a summary out later on, just so that everybody is on the same page. And if they're not, you have an opportunity to correct it as close to the negotiation as possible. If there is follow-up, do that as soon as you can. Especially if it's something that the agreement is contingent on, because there is this thing that happens where as time passes between the meeting where someone said yes and the contract that you were supposed to sign, that contract sort of starts looking further and further away, and it's more and more likely that the deal falls through. So if you want to close that deal, you got to follow up right away. And then lastly, if a deal is tentative, so let's suppose you're agreeing to like a term sheet, or somebody else just has to sign off. Avoid implying that you don't have influence. It is very, very common for somebody else to have to look at something or sign off on something before a deal is finalized. That does not mean that you don't count in that negotiation. But you can make yourself look like you don't count in negotiation by saying things like, oh, I'm really just going to have to make sure that so-and-so agrees to this first. So think about the tone of voice that you're using when you tell somebody that someone else has to sign off on a deal, and make them feel like you mattered, like they're working with the person who has real influence, and there's just this sort of logistical detail that somebody else has to sign a deal or has to look at the deal before it can be signed, so that you aren't that middleman. Caveat: if really somebody else has to be heavily involved, then that expectation needs to be set from the very beginning. So don't imply that you have influence that you really, truly don't have, but don't sell yourself short either. And also, if you do have to walk away, again, sometimes success is walking away. But if you're going to do it, then absolutely make sure that your best alternative really is better than a deal. Something that we see with women in particular is like a little bit of impatience and this thing where like we don't necessarily want to engage in the negotiation for a long time. So that either can mean that we agree to something in the deal that's really not as good as it could be, or we walk away a little bit too fast. If you can be a little bit more patient with a negotiation, it might be that you can get a deal that is better than your best alternative. So be careful walking away too soon just because it looks like something isn't going to close. If you do have to walk away, though, be tactful about it. So I am sure that we have all seen some fantastic movies with some like great scenes where somebody storms out or bangs their fists on the table, or maybe you've unfortunately seen that happen in real life. You don't want to be that person. Most of the time, you want to be the person who somebody can come back to. So think of it as you want to leave the door a little open. You want somebody to come back to you if their alternative didn't work out. You want to make sure that your reputation is intact after a negotiation, even if you didn't agree to something. So never, ever, ever threaten the other side. Try to avoid kind of like movie theater bad behavior. And ideally, you both agree that something isn't working out, and maybe there will be another time when you work together again. Okay. Now, I see that we are headed towards the end of our time, so what should you remember here? You want to remember that an interest-based negotiation has these 4 phases, and our 4 phases are explore. So who are the parties? What are their positions? But more importantly, what are their interests? 2, expand. What options do you have? So what resources are limited? What resources can be expanded? How can you brainstorm for more? 3, divide. So how will you divide the pie so that both parties feel like they got a fair deal? And mostly this is going to mean, what's your offer strategy going to look like? And how are you going to make it aspirational but also fair and justified? And then lastly, agree. So is your deal better than your best alternative? If so, make sure that you're getting that final commitment and that you are being specific about it. Now, this was a whirlwind of negotiations, so hopefully you picked up a couple of tips. I'm going to take some questions in a minute. If you are interested in more or you want some practice, my company does training, negotiation training specifically, and we specialize in customized negotiation. So specifically creating exercises that are built around your negotiations. But since this group is presumably a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of you might be more interested in something we call the Share the Trainer program. So this is for somebody who maybe has their own business and works with a small team, or whose company isn't doing negotiation training, but you want it personally. If you are interested in negotiation training, but you don't want sort of to foot the high bill that a corporate client would have, then you can sign up for our Share the Trainer program. There is no fee just to get on our list, and basically what this does is it puts you on a list of people who are interested potentially in negotiation training. So we will ask you things like, where are you located? What kind of negotiations are you doing? What kind of training are you interested in? And then if there are enough other people in your area that sign up for the program, then we'll contact all of you and see if we can't coordinate a training program for that group of people. So Share the Trainer, basically. in your area. Signing up, again, doesn't cost anything, and you aren't committed until we actually have dates for you. So it's a low-risk thing if you are interested. And at this point, let's go ahead and take some questions. So Russ, will you help me with that?
No, certainly, Sunny. Fantastic. And you're obviously resonating with the audience there. We've got lots of people saying that, firstly, they loved your orange analogy and the basic rule of why. So that's obviously really hit a spot there. Somebody else saying, love your point about when you were talking about, is it okay to walk away? And somebody saying they've had many situations whereby it's not been not a no, but it's not now. And as long as the trust and integrity is held and built up, you can walk away, but it'll come back round again. So that is excellent as well. So we've got time for a couple of questions. Let's have a little look here. You mentioned earlier on the cultural element of negotiations. As a professional negotiator, do you think it's ever okay not to negotiate? This person's asking, should they always be looking for a deal? Is there always a negotiation on the table?
You know, I think that's actually a really good point because, look, like as an entrepreneur, we have a lot that we have to do. And so our energy is limited in some ways. And if you're really paying attention to, like, this kind of prep, that takes some time. So, like, you can't do the prep that I'm talking about in 15 minutes. It's going to take an hour. So when hours are limited, I do think that it makes sense to say to yourself, is this a situation where I want to negotiate and, like, it's really worth it to put that effort in? Or is this a situation where really, like, it's a one-shot kind of deal and I'm basically okay with what's going on? And I would judge that based on, how important is this particular deal to you? Is there a precedent that's going to be set? So, like, if you don't negotiate, is that going to make it seem like you're sort of just willing to take whatever the other person offers? Honestly, I do think that time is a factor. And I will say, as a negotiation trainer, I do not negotiate every deal. I pick and choose my battles because I do think that is also part of trust building, and that sometimes there's a thing that happens, especially with people that you are trying to build a relationship with, where you've got to be sensitive to, like, how are they going to perceive my effort to get a better price? So you want to be confident. You need to negotiate when it matters. But, yeah, I think sometimes you don't.
Love that. And I think what you just said there is a great segue into a question that we've got here. I think you may well have answered it, but would you say that challenging your customer using constructive tension is a more effective method than the traditional negotiation methods, such as you said, building relationships?
So there's this kind of like big thing out there right now in selling. It's called consultative selling. And so potentially the person that asked this question has read something about the challenger method or about consultative selling generally. And basically the premise of that is that we build better relationships by challenging our customers. And that doesn't necessarily mean challenging what they're willing to pay us. It means challenging their assumptions about how their models are working or about kind of, what their services are doing for them that our services could be doing better for them. I do think that if you really understand your stuff, and especially if you really have gone through that exploration phase and you feel like you understand your customer, then there's absolutely a place where you say to them, I've thought about kind of what you're doing. Have you ever thought about this alternative? Have you ever considered that maybe you would make more money if you were doing X instead of Y? And of course, you're probably steering them towards your product, but still, I think that yes, I think it happens. But again, the key point to all of this is trust. So it's all about them feeling like you really know what you're talking about, and that is both credibility and competence, right? So, like, as you're talking with your customer, you've got to be displaying that you really understand their business challenges and also how you could potentially help them. Because if you're just sort of going into a conversation and just straight up challenging them without understanding them, then I think that it doesn't ring true and it doesn't build that relationship. so you're not going to get as far from it.
Love that. Great advice, Sandy. And you've done a brilliant job of answering lots and lots of questions as we go through. So we've probably got time for one more question before we bring the session to a close. And I think this is going back to when you were talking about positions versus interests and finding out, what do the parties say they want, what do they really want, etc. And this question, I think it's quite a good one, is should you be looking to ask open questions only? Is there a place for closed questions at the negotiation table?
Yeah, no, it's actually a really good question. And to the person that asked this, I'm sorry I didn't answer it earlier. I really strongly believe in listening as a way to get information. And so, I mean, I have like an hour answer for you. But let me give you the short answer to that. No, you shouldn't just be asking open questions to get information. Open questions are a listening tool. So asking the why questions, asking the how questions, that opens up the conversation. But there are a number of other ways to do it. So, for example, just being silent in a conversation and giving the other person space to talk. A lot of times in a negotiation, we really feel like we have to have something to say at every minute. And not only that, but we treat it like an argument or a debate instead of as an honest conversation. You get more from the other side if you're not preparing your answers in advance and if you're in the moment. So sometimes just sitting back and listening to what they have to say and giving them a chance to think it through is a way to get information. And clarifying questions, too, have a place. So, I mean, there's certainly a time where you ask the yes-no questions or the are you talking about this person or that person questions. Those tend to limit the conversation, so they're not going to give you as much open information. But definitely there's a place for them. And then lastly, summarizing and repeating back what they say. So we think of this as reflective listening, where somebody says something to you and you literally give it back to them. You repeat it, you summarize it, you paraphrase it, you tell them what they told you. And it seems like that would close the conversation. It does if you got it right. So if you give them back what they said and they go, yeah, exactly, right, then you know that, okay, you understood, you got that piece of information and you can move on. But if you didn't get it right, they'll probably give you more information. So they'll say, no, actually, and then you'll have gotten something that you otherwise wouldn't have understood. So no, open questions are not the only way to get information. There's lots of listening tools.
That is excellent. Great answer to, as you say, a very, very potentially a long answer. So yeah. Love it. We have now come to the end of the session, Sandy. I've learnt so much, absolutely brilliant. I've got a feeling that my boss is listening as well. So Melissa, I'll be negotiating some pay tomorrow. Really, really good, Sandy. Thank you so much. And for everybody that joined us, so we've been asked about will the recordings of the webinar be available? So yes, the recording of this webinar and all others over the course of the virtual summit this week will be available to view again here on the Bright Talk platform. They'll also be emailed to you as well. If you haven't already done so, please make sure that you register for and attend the remaining sessions that are taking place tomorrow. I know that we're starting off with a great session on legal tips for entrepreneurs. Please also remember to visit napw.com for details of the benefits that membership of the NAPW brings. So to close, thanks again to Sandy. Absolutely brilliant session. Thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon, and I look forward to welcoming you to the remaining virtual seminar session starting at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow.
Thanks so much, Russ, and thank you to everybody on the line.